He left her when he found out they were not going to have children. 20 years later, a chance encounter makes him wonder why there are 3 young men who look like him next to his ex-wife. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you watch us from. The Aurora Hotel stood like a monument to elegance and prestige, its golden facade shimmering beneath the velvet curtain of night. Chandeliers blazed within the grand ballroom, casting a warm, opulent glow over the polished marble floors where the city's elite gathered in their finest attire. The murmur of conversation, the soft clink of crystal glasses, and the melodic hum of a jazz quartet wove together into a symphony of affluence and refinement. Amidst the swirl of gowns and tailored suits, one woman moved with effortless grace, her presence commanding attention without a word. Adela Taylor, the evening's honored guest and founder of the Legacy of Tomorrow Foundation, epitomized power and poise. She was a vision in a deep burgundy gown that hugged her silhouette, a delicate diamond pendant resting just above her collarbone. The subtle fragrance of jasmine trailed her movements, and the confidence in her stride was as undeniable as the influence she wielded in the business world. Yet, beneath the polished surface, something restless flickered within her, a guarded ember that no amount of triumph could extinguish. The gala was an annual affair, a celebration of her foundation's achievements in supporting marginalized entrepreneurs. She had stood on many stages, shaken countless hands, and delivered numerous speeches, but tonight felt different. The air seemed charged, carrying an unfamiliar tension that she could neither name nor shake. It clung to her skin, a whisper of something just beyond sight. A waiter approached with a tray of champagne flutes, and Adela accepted one with a slight nod, her eyes sweeping across the room. Senators, CEOs, philanthropists, faces both familiar and forgettable. She exchanged the requisite pleasantries with a practiced smile, but her heart wasn't in it. She had long mastered the art of polite disinterest, and tonight it felt heavier than ever. Then it happened. Her gaze, wandering without intent, froze mid-course. Across the room, partially obscured by the milling crowd, stood a man she hadn't seen in 2 decades. The crystal flute in her hand stilled, and the surrounding murmur faded into an eerie hush. Her breath hitched, her pulse quickened, and for a heartbeat, time collapsed into a singular moment, a collision of past and present. Michael Reed. The years had left their subtle marks on him, a touch of silver at his temples, the sharper lines of his jaw, but he was unmistakable. His posture still carried that composed authority, the kind that once drew her to him and drove her mad in equal measure. But what struck her most were his eyes, still that intense shade of storm-washed blue. And they were fixed on her. A rush of memories surged unbidden, whispered promises on rainy nights, arguments sharp with heartbreak, and the final, irrevocable silence that followed his departure. Her chest tightened, and a flicker of something raw sparked behind the polished veneer she wore so well, but she did not falter. She would not falter. She felt the familiar presence of her 3 children beside her. Noah, thoughtful and observant, adjusted his glasses while surveying the room with quiet curiosity. Gabriel, taller and broad-shouldered, radiated a protective energy, his gaze sharp and assessing. Lillian, poised and self-assured, carried an aura of both elegance and defiance. They were her pride, her purpose, the living proof of every battle she had fought and won. It was Michael's reaction to them that made the air in the room shift. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked from one face to the next. Adela saw the moment realization began to claw at the edges of his understanding. His expression, once composed, wavered. Confusion, disbelief, and something dangerously close to recognition rippled across his face. Noah's thoughtful eyes, Gabriel's strong jawline, Lillian's piercing gaze, all reflections, echoes that he could not deny. He paled, his mask cracking under the weight of what his eyes screamed, but his mind refused to accept. Adela felt the tension coil in her spine, a battle drum in her chest. She saw the questions forming on his lips from across the room, the unspoken demands for explanations he had long forfeited the right to. And still he stared, haunted by the impossibility standing before him. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly around her champagne glass. She had not expected this moment, but if life had taught her anything, it was that the past had a cruel habit of resurfacing when you least wanted it. The walls she had built over 20 years felt suddenly paper-thin, but she would not let them fall. Not now. Not for him. The band shifted to a slower tune and the room seemed to exhale, but for Adela and Michael the air remained charged, thick with questions unspoken and truths unacknowledged. She turned slightly, her profile catching the light, and in that silent motion lay her message. The past was gone. What stood before him now was not a woman pleading for answers, but a fortress built from every shard of what he had broken. She moved away from his line of sight, her children instinctively falling into step beside her. Yet she felt his eyes linger, the weight of his gaze a tether she couldn't shake. Across the room, Michael stood rooted, his pulse pounding, his world teetering on the edge of a truth he could neither fathom nor ignore. Questions crashed in his mind, loud and merciless. How? Who were they? And why hadn't he known? But beneath the confusion, beneath the shock, a singular, undeniable certainty took hold. He would find out, and he would not stop until he did. The echoes of the gala still throbbed in Michael Reed's chest long after he had left the Aurora Hotel. The night air was cool against his skin, but it did nothing to calm the inferno raging within him. His car's engine purred quietly beneath his trembling hands on the steering wheel, but he made no move to drive. His mind was a chaotic storm, each thought a crashing wave against his reason. He had seen them. He had seen them. 3 young faces, striking, familiar, impossible. Their eyes, their expressions, the unmistakable fragments of himself woven into their features. And Adela, standing there, poised and untouchable, guarding them with the silent ferocity of a fortress wall. It couldn't be, but it was. With a sudden surge of determination, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a steady, familiar voice answered. "John Carter speaking." "John." Michael's voice was tight, urgent, the control he usually wore like armor nowhere to be found. "I need you on something, immediately." A pause. "Michael, didn't expect to hear from you. What's got you this rattled?" "Adela Taylor," Michael snapped, his pulse roaring in his ears. "I need everything. Her life after I left. Medical records, family history, legal documents, and—" His throat constricted around the words, but he forced them out. "Find out about her children. Birth certificates. Anything you can get." A beat of silence from the other end. "Children?" John's voice sharpened. "Did you say children?" "Yes," Michael said, his knuckles whitening on the wheel. 3 young adults, and—" His voice dropped, thick with disbelief. "They look like me." Another pause. "Jesus, Michael, I'm on it. But you better be ready for whatever I find." The line clicked dead, and Michael sat back, his chest heaving. Ready? No, he wasn't ready, but he had to know. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur, The city's lights smeared against the windshield, cold and distant. His mind replayed the gala over and over, each detail sharper than the last. Adela's eyes when she saw him, shock, guardedness, and something more. Something that told him she wasn't surprised by his confusion. She had expected it. Hours passed in restless pacing, his polished floors bearing the scuff of his indecision. He couldn't sleep. His mind wouldn't let him. Then his phone buzzed. A message from John. "Got something. Call me." Michael's pulse quickened as he hit the call button. "Talk," he demanded the second John answered. "Adela Taylor," John began, his voice clipped and efficient. "After you split, she threw herself into building her career. Started her foundation about 16 years ago. She's a major figure now, public, polished, but keeps her private life sealed tight." Michael's jaw clenched. "What about the kids?" "That's where it gets interesting," John said carefully. "I ran every check. No adoption records, no surrogacy arrangements, no foster care. According to the state registry," he paused as if hesitant to deliver the blow, "they're biologically hers." Michael felt the room tilt. His hand gripped the edge of his desk so hard his fingers ached. "That's impossible," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She couldn't." "That's what I thought," John replied. "But there's more. I pulled medical records, quietly. There's a note about a procedure, something experimental. A fertility treatment conducted shortly after your departure." Michael's breath sharpened. "What treatment?" "Advanced reproductive therapy," John said, "led by a doctor, Edgar Haynes. Name ring a bell?" Michael's stomach dropped. It did. Dr. Haynes, pioneering, controversial, and renowned for pushing the boundaries of reproductive science. "His records are sealed tight," John continued. "But from what I dug up, Adela was part of a cutting-edge trial. And, well, it worked." A long, ringing silence. Michael's heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. "John," he said slowly, his voice strangled with tension, "are you telling me—" "They're biologically hers," John said, his voice flat. "And," he hesitated, "they're biologically yours too." The world fractured. The phone slipped from Michael's fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull crack. His knees gave, and he dropped into the nearest chair. The air knocked from his lungs. The room around him blurred, the towering glass windows, the sprawling city skyline, all of it swallowed by the roaring in his ears. His children. His. A lifetime of belief, shattered. A choice he thought was final, obliterated. Adela had been pregnant, with his children, and he had never known. Shame and rage collided in his chest, an unholy tempest that made his hands tremble. She had kept it from him. She had known, and she had raised them alone, never telling him the truth. But under the fury lay something far more unbearable. Grief. He had missed it all. Their first steps, their first words, their birthdays, their laughter, their triumphs and tears. 19 years of moments that could never be reclaimed. He hadn't just lost them, they had lost him. And it was a loss they never even knew they suffered. His throat closed, his chest crushed beneath the weight of the years he would never get back. But he wasn't going to lose them again. His fingers tightened into fists, his heart pounding with grim resolve. He would find them. He would face Adela. And this time, he wouldn't leave until he knew everything. The truth had taken 19 years. It would wait no longer. The townhouse stood with quiet elegance, nestled on a tree-lined street where time seemed to soften its edges. The windows glowed with a warm, golden light against the approaching dusk, a beacon of peace and belonging. But for Michael Reed, standing at the wrought iron gate, the sight was anything but welcoming. His heart pounded, his palms damp despite the cool breeze. This place, their place, was a stranger to him now, but he hadn't come for comfort. He had come for truth. The walk to the front door felt longer than it should. His steps, usually so assured, now carried the weight of 2 lost decades. He paused, his knuckles hovering just above the door's surface. A fleeting thought whispered, "Walk away. Leave the past where it belongs." But he silenced it. He had already spent 19 years running from this threshold. The knock was firm, decisive. There was no going back. The door creaked open, and he was met with a pair of sharp, curious eyes. Eyes that struck him with a force he hadn't expected. A young woman, barely out of her teens but carrying a presence beyond her years, stood in the doorway. Her expression was guarded, her lips pressed in a line of silent inquiry. Her skin, warm and deep as polished mahogany, caught the soft glow from inside, and her high cheekbones and strong jawline felt like echoes of himself and of Adela. His voice, rough and unfamiliar, broke the silence. "I'm looking for Adela Taylor." The young woman's brows lifted slightly, her posture cool and defensive. "Who's asking?" A sharp edge in her voice, mistrust, suspicion. His throat tightened. "My name is Michael Reed." He paused, the weight of the moment settling heavy and cold. "I knew her a long time ago." Something flickered in her gaze, awareness, tension. She studied him with a scrutiny that felt far too practiced for someone her age. Then, with a subtle shift in her stance, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossing over her chest, a barrier both casual and firm. "You're late," she said, her voice cutting, matter of fact. The words landed like a slap, and he felt their sting beneath his ribs. His mouth opened, but no response came. From behind her, footsteps. 2 more figures emerged, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other slender and thoughtful. The moment they entered his line of sight, the air changed, thickening with something unspoken but undeniable. Them. The boys. No, young men. The reflections he had seen at the gala now standing before him in undeniable clarity. The taller one, with a build like an athlete's and eyes that smoldered with challenge, was the first to step forward, his stance protective. The other, more reserved, his expression carefully measured behind wire-rimmed glasses, hung back but watched with a sharpness that saw everything. "Lillian," the taller one said to the girl, his tone low, edged with warning, "who is this?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Apparently," she said coolly, "he's someone who used to know Mom." The way she said it, like a blade dipped in something bitter, made his stomach clench. The young man's eyes pinned Michael with a look so familiar it stole his breath. It was the look he saw in the mirror every time he faced his regrets. "Is that true?" the young man demanded, his voice steady but taut with suspicion. "You knew her?" Michael's mouth felt dry. But then, from beyond them, another set of footsteps, and his world tilted. Adela? She appeared at the end of the hallway, and for a second, time folded in on itself. She was both who she had been and who she was now, every inch the formidable woman he remembered, but tempered by the years and the battles he had not been there to fight by her side. Her eyes, those eyes he had once drowned in, met his. They darkened instantly, and he saw it. The recognition, the shock, the guard snapping into place. Her voice, low and laced with steel, broke the fragile silence. "Michael." The sound of his name from her lips, after all this time, was a blow and a bomb all at once. He swallowed, his voice rough. "Adela." Her gaze flicked briefly to the three standing between them, then back to him. It was a mother's glance, a silent, instinctive check that her children were safe. And when her eyes returned to his, they burned with cold fire. "You shouldn't be here." The chill in her voice sliced through him, but he stood his ground. "We need to talk." Her jaw clenched, and for a fleeting second, something raw flashed beneath her mask, something old and wounded, but she covered it quickly. "We have nothing to say to each other." But Michael's voice broke, low and strained. "I know." His hands curled at his sides, trembling with all he had carried to this doorstep. "I know about them, Adela." The room froze. A flicker, there in her eyes, pain, sharp and unguarded before the shutters slammed back down. "I found out," he pressed, his voice gravel-thick with anguish. "I know they're mine." A sudden, sharp intake of breath from the young man. The girl, Lillian, stiffened, and the other boy, Noah, Michael's mind supplied, glanced quickly at Adela, questions blazing behind his lenses. But it was Gabriel, the firebrand, who moved first, his fists tight, his voice laced with restrained fury. "You left," he bit out, the word cracking like a whip. "You didn't know because you weren't here. You didn't care." The blow of those words from his son's mouth sent shards of glass through Michael's chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed, and the silence that followed was jagged and merciless. "Gabriel," Adela warned, her voice firm but not unkind. But the young man's fire was already unleashed. "He left us before we even existed," Gabriel shot, his eyes blazing at Michael, raw and unflinching. "So why the hell does he get to come back now and demand anything?" The fury, the hurt, the rightness of it stole Michael's breath. He had prepared himself for anything, except for the pain of hearing the truth through his son's voice. "I didn't know," he managed, the words rasping from his throat, heavy and hollow. "And if you had?" This time it was Lillian, her voice sharp, each syllable a blade. "If you had known, would you have stayed?" The question stopped his heart, because it wasn't just a question, it was the question. The one he had never dared to answer, even in the darkest corners of his own mind. Would he have stayed? He wanted to say yes. He ached to say yes. But the man he had been, the man who walked away, hadn't believed in what could be built from broken things. He had believed leaving was mercy. And, in doing so, he had become the architect of every wound they now carried. The silence that followed his hesitation was deafening. "That's what I thought," Gabriel said bitterly, his voice tight with contempt. Michael's chest felt like it would cave in from the pressure of his own failings. "I can't undo the past," he said, his voice raw, stripped of every pretense. "I won't insult you by pretending I can. I was wrong. I was—" His voice broke, and for a moment he couldn't find the words. "I was a coward. I thought I was protecting her, protecting myself. But I was wrong." His gaze, hollowed by 19 years of loss, found each of them in turn. "But I'm here now, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you for anything." His voice dropped, barely a whisper. "Except the chance to know you, if you'll let me." The room felt too still, the air too thin, and in that silence a lifetime stood between them. Gabriel's fists loosened, but the fire in his eyes did not. Noah's expression, though guarded, was pensive, calculating. Lillian's lips pressed tight, her gaze a wall no plea could scale. But it was Adela, always Adela, who broke the silence. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but weighted with the force of every year he had missed. "This isn't about you, Michael," she said. It never was. She glanced toward their children, her eyes dark with something he could only name as sorrow. It's about them. She met his gaze once more, and he felt the finality in her next words like a cold, closing door. And it's their choice, not yours, not mine. The room seemed to exhale, the tension releasing just enough to leave the sting of what lingered behind. Lillian, sharp as ever, pierced the silence with a question that wasn't a question. "So?" she said flatly, her eyes on him but her meaning for all of them. "What now?" Michael's throat was tight, his voice low but steady. "Now," he said, "I wait." A flicker passed between them, between all of them, unspoken, uncertain, and unresolved. But there. And for the first time in 19 years, the man who had always walked away stayed. The world didn't shift overnight. There was no grand reconciliation, no cinematic embrace to dissolve the weight of the past. Instead, there was silence, a silence that felt both fragile and unbearable. After the confrontation, Michael left without protest, his presence lingering like an echo in the hallways of Adela's home. The questions he'd ignited remained, hanging heavy in the air, but answers would not come quickly. Trust could not be demanded, it could only be earned, and earning it would be a slow, uphill climb. The days that followed felt like standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. Michael did not push. He did not chase. He knew that the next move was not his to make, but he did not disappear. He stayed, quietly, distantly, but present. The first signs came in small ripples. Noah was the first to break the silence. It wasn't an invitation exactly. It was a test. An impersonal message, curt and to the point. "There's a book signing tomorrow. A musician I admire. You might like his work." The shop on 5th, 3 p.m. Michael's heart stuttered when he read it. It wasn't warmth, but it was a crack in the wall, and he would take it. The next afternoon, he arrived at the bookshop, carefully early, but not too early. Noah was already there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Michael felt the chasm between them, wide and treacherous, but he stepped across it with a simple, "Mind if I join you?" Noah only nodded. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. They listened together as the musician spoke about his creative process, his struggles, and his triumphs. When the signing began, Michael bought a copy and offered it to Noah. "It's yours," he said simply. "Mark it up. Let me know your favorite parts." Noah took the book, his fingers brushing the cover thoughtfully. His eyes flicked up, guarded but considering. "We'll see." It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Gabriel's barrier was made of fire, not ice. His resentment burned hot and sharp, and he made no effort to conceal it. But there was something else beneath it. A challenge, a dare to cross the line and face the flames. It happened at a community gym. Michael, passing by on an evening walk, saw him through the window, driving himself mercilessly on the basketball court. The ball's rhythmic thump was a heartbeat to his anger, and when their eyes met through the glass, Gabriel's expression was unmistakable. "Try me." Michael entered the gym without hesitation, the smell of varnished wood and faint sweat greeting him like an old memory. Gabriel stood, ball in hand, eyes blazing. "Want to play, old man?" Michael's lips quirked, a ghost of something between challenge and acceptance. "Depends. You afraid I'll win?" The game was brutal. Gabriel played like he was trying to exercise every ounce of resentment with every pivot, every block, every shot. Michael, older but not yet slow, met him point for point. There were no words, only the clash of sneakers on hardwood, the hiss of the net, the sharp smack of a blocked shot. When it ended, 21-20, Gabriel's win, They stood, chests heaving, sweat trickling. Gabriel's voice was rough, but not with exhaustion. "Why now?" Michael's throat was raw, his voice low and hoarse. "Because I should have been here before, and because I won't walk away again." Gabriel's jaw tightened. His grip on the ball loosened, and he let it drop, the hollow bounce echoing in the empty gym. He said nothing more, but he didn't walk away. Lillian remained the hardest to reach. Her walls were high, her guard impenetrable. She didn't ask for his presence, and she certainly didn't welcome it. She watched him from a distance, her sharp eyes always searching, always dissecting. It was during a community fundraiser, a small bustling event for Adela's foundation, that the ice began to crack. Lillian had volunteered to manage the auction, her clipboard a shield, her efficiency a weapon. Michael arrived, uninvited but unobtrusive, blending into the background with no expectation. When a technical glitch froze the bidding system, frustration flared across Lillian's face. Before she could snap at the technician, Michael stepped forward. "Need a hand?" he offered calmly. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed she would refuse purely on principle. But the crowd was restless, and time was ticking. She gave a tight, reluctant nod. Michael worked quickly, his fingers moving with practiced ease over the screen. "Had my share of tech disasters," he murmured. "The trick is knowing which wire they didn't check." Minutes later, the system flickered back to life, and a cheer rippled through the room. Lillian's lips pressed together, and for a second, her usual sarcasm softened. "Not bad," she allowed. Michael's reply was soft, steady. "You're good at this. You've got her fire." Her eyes sharpened, the shield snapping back into place. "I've got my own fire." A pause, then a quiet, "I can see that." She didn't thank him, but she didn't push him away either. Adela watched these fragile encounters unfold from a distance. She didn't interfere. She didn't guide. She simply observed, her heart pulled taut between the past and the possibility of a future. She kept her walls high, but they no longer felt impenetrable. She saw the effort Michael poured into each step, each moment. He never demanded, never assumed. He showed up, he listened, he stayed, and he gave them something he had never given before: time. The hardest conversation, though, was not with them. It was with her. It happened on a crisp autumn evening. The fundraiser had ended, and the children had gone their separate ways. Michael, still lingering on the balcony of Adela's home, watched the city lights shimmer beyond the skyline. Adela stepped beside him, the scent of jasmine familiar even after all these years. She spoke first, her voice calm but weighted. "I've seen you trying." His reply came, low and honest. "It's the only thing I know how to do now." Her eyes, dark and unfathomable, turned to him. "You didn't come back for me?" It wasn't a question. "No," he said softly. "I came back because I found what I lost, and because I don't want to lose them, but—" He hesitated, then added, "I won't lie. I wanted to see you." She looked out at the city, her posture still but tense. "I don't know what you expect, Michael." His voice was rough with something old and raw. "Nothing. I don't expect anything." A pause. "But I know what I regret." A long silence stretched between them, filled with the echoes of every choice and every consequence. "I regret leaving you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I regret believing that we couldn't be whole without something we didn't have." His hand curled against the balcony's cold iron. "And I regret not knowing them sooner, every day." Her voice, when it came, was soft but unyielding. "You left. That choice was yours." "I know, he said, and his voice broke on the words. "I live with it every day." Adela's gaze finally met his, and in it was the raw, unvarnished truth. "And now?" His answer was stripped bare of everything but what was real. "Now," he said, "I don't leave, not again." She studied him for a long, silent moment, and then, with a grace that was not surrender but acknowledgement, she stepped back and said only, "It's not my choice to make." The days turned to weeks. The walls remained, but cracks formed, and in the cracks light grew. Noah began to send him articles and book recommendations, short notes, but steady. Gabriel challenged him to another game. And another. The trash talk softened. The silences grew companionable. Lillian, sharp and watchful, let him answer her questions about his work, his mistakes, his reasons. She didn't forgive, but she began to understand. And Adela, always Adela, watched him earn, moment by moment, what he could never reclaim but could still build anew. The final bridge came on a late afternoon. The sun was warm, the sky clear. Michael sat at a small cafe table, waiting for whoever chose to show. And then they arrived. Noah, holding his book. Gabriel, with a basketball under his arm. Lillian, her arms crossed but her expression curious. And Adela, watchful, steady, and quietly, cautiously hopeful. They didn't sit with him, not yet, but they sat near. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a return, but it was something. It was choice, and it was beginning. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more captivating narratives. Share this video with your friends and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't miss out. Watch our other stories for more unforgettable moments. See you in the next video.